Appreciate everyone attending the meeting. Hopefully this will be very informative. I think it's probably on the forefront of what everyone's going through and thinking about the last 6 to 8 months and going forward right now. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Gleb. He is an internationally renowned thought leader known as disaster avoidance expert. He's on a mission to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases by developing the most effective risk management and decision-making strategies. He's a best-selling author of several traditionally published books. One of his more well-known books is Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. His newest book, which is pretty new, I'd assume, is Resilience, Adapt, and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. He's been featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews on some prominent venues like USA Today, CNBC, Fortune, Time, Fast Company, Inc. Magazine, and many more. He has over 20 years of experience with consulting, coaching, speaking, and training on decision-making and risk management strategies. His expertise comes from research, as a background as a behavioral scientist with over 15 years of academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State. He's been published dozens of times in peer-reviewed articles in academic journals. In his free time, he likes to make sure he spends an abundant quality time with his wife at home to avoid disasters in his personal and his home life. Dr. Gleb, I'll let you take it over. Thank you very much. We appreciate you presenting tonight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, everyone. So let's talk about how we can manage to thrive effectively in the pandemic, how you as payroll professionals can do so. That's what the goal of today's presentation is about. So the first thing we want to address, and I'll be talking about, by the way, vaccines and all that stuff and updated information. But before we talk about vaccines and all the updated information, I want to take us back to the early days of the pandemic. And so we can understand how people actually coped with it, how prominent leaders coped with it. Not very well. So let's take a look at prominent business leaders like Elon Musk. Obviously, a very prominent business leader, leads Tesla, SpaceX, and so on. Well, on March 6th, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb, just as the coronavirus pandemic was taking off really here in the US. And as you see, given his popularity, his following on Twitter, where he's very vocal and very popular and prominent, got 1.7 million likes, so very powerful. Then, just a couple of weeks later, on March 19th, after the declaration of the national emergency here in the US, he tweeted that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. He was very wrong. And so were many people who listened to him and who followed him. So many people who are entrepreneurial, who lead many technology companies, made bad mistakes because listening to Elon Musk and people like that. But Elon Musk wasn't the only one. So we talked about new money. So let's talk about old money. People like Goldman Sachs, or organizations, companies like Goldman Sachs. Doesn't get more old money than that, right? It's Goldman Sachs, financial services company, analyst company, investment company. One of the things they do is for their clients, they make predictions of estimates of US GDP growth. So they made estimates of US GDP growth in the second quarter of 2020. And they said in February 24th, so that was as the coronavirus pandemic was taking off in Italy and starting to be prevalent here, become prevalent here, but not really taking off yet. They said that there would be 2.7% growth of US GDP in the second quarter. Then March 15th, so just a couple of weeks later, they revised that estimate to 5% decline, from 2.7% growth to 5% decline. That's a 7.7% mistakes, very badly off clearly. But just a few days later, on March 20th, less than a week, they made another estimate. So from 5% decline, it now went to a 24% decline. Whoa, clearly 19% difference. Wow, that's a huge decline. In the end, they were actually wrong. They underestimated the decline. It was about 33% decline of US GDP growth in the second quarter. Clearly, lots of people made mistakes, and most people, as a result, were unprepared for the pandemic. And so before we talk about the details of that, I want you to go to the website you see over there. I'm going to put it also on the chat. So you should be able to see the chat. You should be able to see the website. So please go to that website that you see in the chat, and we'll be voting on the pandemic, and we'll be voting on the situation. So please go there for us to vote and for you to engage. All right, so please make sure that you go to that site, and then we'll be voting in just a bit. So again, it's in the chat, go to the site, pretty easy. All right. Now, as you're thinking about the pandemic, and I want you to think about the fact that most companies underestimated the threat. They made bad mistakes about the threat because of people like Elon Musk, because of Goldman Sachs, new money, old money. And so they were quite unprepared by the pandemic. They were in a pretty bad situation with the pandemic. And as you think about that, I want you to vote. Way back in March, how well did your organization anticipate the pandemic? So please vote. Okay. See 49 participants, but only 26 people are on the website. So please, the rest, make sure to go to the chat and go to the website so that you can vote. Again, go to the chat and go to the website. I'll give you 10 more seconds to do so. 10 more seconds. Veronica says she's having trouble accessing the website. Maybe try a different browser. So using Chrome, that should be, Okay, go to the chat. Something might be wrong with the number, with just typing in the thing from the screen might be an issue. So just go to the chat and click on the website in the chat. All right. So while other folks figure out how to get on, let's close the poll. So we're not going to take more time, but everyone should make sure to go to the poll and vote. All right, good. I see more people voted. So you should be able to see the results. About 15% of the voters either seriously or moderately overestimated the impact. About 20%, just over 20% got it spot on. But the large majority, we see that just about 65% moderately underestimated its impact or seriously underestimated its impact. So this is something that you'll typically see, and that's how folks respond, that the large majority moderately or seriously underestimated the impact of the pandemic, and aligns with what happened with Elon Musk and with Goldman Sachs. That's a serious problem, and that's something that we need to be able to understand why that's happening and address it effectively. And so we'll be talking about that. Now, as the people engaged with the pandemic, as they started, okay, this is a serious issue, what they typically used to engage with the pandemic were their business continuity plans. So their business continuity plans, that's typically what they use to try to address the problems caused by the pandemic. But this is an issue. As a disaster avoidance expert and someone who's been consulting on this for over 20 years, I've done a lot of business continuity plans. And what I've seen as the typical ones before I get there and work on the business continuity plans is that they're very basic and they're not a good fit for the situation of a pandemic. That's not what they're for. The typical business continuity plans, they're great for emergencies like a hurricane or some kind of other blizzard, Pennsylvania, I understand that. In Columbus, Ohio, I'm in Columbus, Ohio, so I have pretty similar weather in many regards. Blizzards and so on, lots of those sort of serious issues, blackout, that can take a week to 2 weeks to resolve. And that's what business continuity typically are for, 1 to 2 weeks. But that's not what COVID-19 is about. COVID-19 is not an emergency. It's not a 1 to 2 week interruption. It's a major, huge disruptor. It's a slow-moving, high-impact, long-term disruptor. And that's not what business continuity, the typical ones, are for. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And relying on business continuity plans, the typical ones, leads to a lot of serious problems, as I'm sure that a number of you have found out. Let's talk about how we actually get out of COVID-19. Of course, vaccine is really the only effective solution. That's what we've seen as really the only effective solution. We've seen right now, you are probably seeing some headlines about growing third wave of COVID. And this is very true. There's in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, where I am, right next door, and everywhere around the country, the third wave is growing. We have more hospitalizations than we've ever had in this country of COVID. And of course, more new cases and more hospitalizations. And hospitalizations, of course, deaths will soon follow from the hospitalizations in the third wave. So this is a very serious issue, and the winter will be really bad. There are estimates that by the end of the winter, we'll get to over 400,000 deaths. So really, really brutal numbers. It's going to really be a dark winter, as a lot of people are saying. And the research shows that where COVID-19 infections are mainly happening is, well, inside people's homes. So that's one situation where people are getting together and hanging out, taking off their masks, eating, and so on. But they're also happening extensively in indoor places with prolonged exposure. So things like restaurants, gyms, bars, of course, hotels where people spend some time together, houses of worship, workplaces. So it's something to really seriously think about. There's a number of states right now that are asking their employees, the employers, to have their employees stay at home and telecommute and not come into the office. So everything that was happening in early spring, all those shutdowns, they're on the way here again until we actually have a vaccine. So vaccine is really the only effective solution. And after the vaccine is ready, what would need to happen? So you've probably heard that Pfizer came out with some really good news, and I'm really, really excited about some good news for the Pfizer study that showed that its vaccine is highly effective. Now we need to wait to make sure it's safe, which we should know by the end of November. But it's highly effective, that's great. But after we get the approval, the FDA looks through it, makes sure that there's no challenges in the numbers. The government would need to coordinate the process of producing it, distributing it, and vaccinating people. So this is especially the distribution and vaccination. Questions of fairness, questions of who gets it first. The US has already placed an order for many doses, 100 million doses of vaccine with Pfizer. And because you need 2 doses of vaccine, that'll be enough to vaccinate 50 million people. So you have production issues, and Pfizer is definitely trying to ramp up production, but it's a new technology, mRNA, and it's hard to ramp up that technology because it's not something we're as familiar with as old technology. Then distribution. Now, this is a big, big challenge because the Pfizer vaccine needs to be stored at 94 degrees, minus 94 degrees Celsius. Minus 94 degrees Celsius, that's very, very cold. That's something that typical hospitals don't have access to, not to speak of pharmacies or doctors' offices where you and I typically get our flu shots. So it's, here in Columbus, Ohio, it might be something like 10 places that have the required cold storage, research hospitals, university labs. So how would you get people processed through all of that? And then vaccination. There's a lot of people who are really skeptical about vaccines. Unfortunately, there's that anti-vaxxer sentiment, and a lot of these people are not willing to take vaccines. So that will be a big problem as well. So that whole issue, going through the process of production, distribution, and vaccination, we probably will not get to a majority of the population vaccinated until the end of 2021, unfortunately. So maybe in a yearish from now. And that's something we have to anticipate and be ready for, that the pandemic, no matter if we do have an effective vaccine approved by the end of this year, which I very much hope we do, that it will still take about a year from the approval of the vaccine to getting the majority of the population vaccinated and really addressing the pandemic that way. And then it will still take some time to peter out. So this is something we need to be prepared for. It's a long-term disruptor. And our future until it's widespread vaccination is a combination of looser restrictions, which you've seen, followed by an increase in cases, which is exactly what's happening right now. There were restrictions that were loosened in the summer. A number of restrictions were loosened when people could spend more time outdoors. And right now, as people are going indoors and as the virus has an easier time spreading because it spreads easier in cold temperature, there's an increase in cases. And you're seeing right now tighter restrictions. A number of states are imposing tightened restrictions. Some states that didn't have mask mandates, like Utah, now impose mask mandates. Some states are imposing restrictions on bars, restaurants, gyms, and so on, which according to the new research on how COVID spreads makes a lot of sense if you want to address the hospitals, which are about to be overburdened. In some places, by the way, in some states, fortunately, not in Pennsylvania, but for example, North Dakota, hospitals are at near 100% capacity. So it's a very worrying situation. So tighter restrictions will lead to a decrease in cases. And that's what we're facing, these waves, these repeating waves, where we have to deal with various levels of shutdowns until a vaccine becomes widely available, meaning people are widely vaccinated. And we have to realize that the world will change forever. This is something that's not going to be just, okay, we're going to go back to our previous lives after a vaccine. Even after a vaccine is widely available and most of the population is vaccinated, these waves of restrictions, these habits, these anxieties, these emotions, they'll change how we think, the values we have, our habits, our desires, how we behave, our norms. We'll never go back to that idyllic time of January 2020, no matter how much we want. And I'd love to go back to that time, but that's not in the cards. And this is not easy to hear. I mean, when I was researching this, this information is really painful for me. I struggle with it. When I was actually, as a disaster avoidance expert, I was first looking at COVID as it was coming up in China in December 2019. And as I was realizing that, this is going to be bad. The major city, the Wuhan, I mean, it's a huge city. It's 11 million people, produces over $22 billion of goods a year. And it's called the Chicago of China. It's a major industrial metropolis. It has something like 500 international flights a day. So with an average of 200 people per flight, it's bound, 10,000 people going in and out of Wuhan. Of course, the virus is going to spread elsewhere. And given that it caused pretty much the collapse of the public health infrastructure in Wuhan, it was pretty clear to me that it was going to be a major pandemic. And I started talking about it to clients way back when, January, February, started writing op-eds about this, eventually published a book about this in March and so on. And they found it very difficult to accept, my clients. It's a really painful information, but it's going to be much easier to accept this information and deal with it because you need to know, and I know, and that it will be much more painful in the long term if we deny reality and sweep uncomfortable information under the rug, if we don't adapt and accept and adapt to this major disruption. Your role as a payroll professional is as a trusted advisor. You're providing a service, you're providing advice within your organization. And you need to help your leaders, the leaders of your organizations, whether the payroll department, so the finance department, however you're organized. I know most payroll departments are under finance, some are within HR, but whatever department, however you're organized, you need to help the leaders of that department realize the extent of this major disruption. And then, of course, all the other C-suite leaders, because most are way too optimistic about the future. They're way too optimistic about what's going to happen with this vaccine, with COVID, with this third wave. You need to help them prepare for and accept this uncomfortable reality. Doing so, you'll help them accomplish their leadership goals if you do so, of course. So that's one thing. And you'll also build their trust in you as a trusted advisor. So that's going to be very valuable for you in the future as well. And I want to highlight that the impact will not be over soon. So many people are way too optimistic. They think that, hey, it'll blow over soon, but it won't. Hope is not a strategy. You can hope it will blow over soon, but it's just not going to, we're not turning the corner as some people are unfortunately claiming. And you need to prepare for a long-term impact. We'll still be in this for a year or so, and you need to be prepared for that, for this pretty difficult and challenging situation. This pandemic is a slow-moving threat. And right now, what I'm saying, it feels very counterintuitive. It feels very uncomfortable. I mean, I can tell you that I know when I speak to clients, when I speak to do presentations, it's very uncomfortable to hear this information. It's pretty heavy. Unfortunately, we make very bad decisions about such slow-moving threats, ones that are unusual, ones that are slow-moving. That's something that we don't deal with well. Our brains don't deal with it well. Our gut reactions don't deal with it well. We underestimate such threats. We don't see them for their full extent. And that leads to decisions that endanger our businesses and our careers. And of course, other sorts of organizations if you don't work in the company. And so we get bad advice, like from Elon Musk, like from Goldman Sachs, about, hey, what's going to be the likelihood and the outcomes of the pandemic, because of dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. So that's what you want to be afraid of. They come from a combination of our evolutionary background and how our brains are wired. So let's talk a little bit about this, our evolutionary background, how our brains are wired. Well, our evolutionary background, our brains, our gut reactions are wired for the savanna environment. That's what they're wired for. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, that's what neuroscience research shows our brains are adapted to. The modern world has really been around since World War II, and we have not had nearly enough time to evolve for it. Our brain is adapted to that savanna environment, and we make bad decisions about modern threats, especially because of our primary response to threats, which is the fight or flight response. That was great for the savanna because the risks they faced, they weren't immediate and tense in the moment. Our ancestors faced risks like the saber-toothed tiger. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. But the fight or flight response is very dangerous in today's world because the risks we face are much more ambiguous, uncertain, long-term risks. They might come from a notification on your smartphone where someone forwards you an article about a weird disease popping up and resulting in the collapse of the public health infrastructure in Wuhan, China, middle of nowhere, China, right? Well, it's not middle of nowhere, as we talked about. It's the Chicago of China. And there are specifically 3 dangerous judgment errors I want to highlight. 3 dangerous judgment errors: the normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting, which cause us a lot of trouble when we engage and think about COVID and other slow-moving disruptors, high-impact, low-probability, slow-moving disruptors. The normalcy bias. Now, in the savanna environment, it was a pretty good bet that everything will keep going normal. The main change would be the change of the seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter, right? That's not a good bet in the modern world because that normalcy bias, it leads us to estimate that the short-term future will be based on the short-term past. The next couple of years will be just like the last couple of years. That's how we tend to think. That's how our brain works. But in the modern world, that's not the reality. We tend to underestimate greatly major disruptions, the likelihood and their impact. I mean, think about, let's say, the impact of technology, the smartphone. That has caused a major disruption in a few short years to a number of industries. What about the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis? Global crisis because of our interlinked finance caused major disruption. And now the COVID-19 pandemic causing major disruption. Our world is full of such major disruptors, and they happen relatively frequently in the modern world compared to the past. And that's something we need to realize. Before the smartphone, we had the rise of the internet, right? So there are a number of disruptors that challenge us. They're more frequent than once a decade. And that really causes a lot of trouble for us because we don't react well to them. So that's the normalcy bias. The planning fallacy. When we make a plan, we tend to assume that the future will go according to plan. You might have heard the phrase that failing to plan is planning to fail. Unfortunately, that's a misleading phrase because once we make a plan, we tend to assume that we're safe and everything is fine. A much more effective phrase is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Failing to plan for problems is planning to fail because we underestimate problems and the risks when we make a plan. So we underestimate the resources needed to address it. Just like in our business continuity plans, we don't actually plan for all the things that are necessary with business continuity. I mean, how many people had pandemic insurance, right? As you're part of your business interruption insurance. Business interruption insurance doesn't cover pandemics normally. You need to add an additional rider to it to cover pandemics. And the large majority of businesses didn't. And then, of course, they're having a lot of trouble claiming their insurance. Well, that's what happens when you don't look at your insurance closely and you don't think about what actually might happen. So what kind of resources? You need time resources, money, information, social capital. You need all of these resources more than you tend to think you do. And that's the planning fallacy. And finally, hyperbolic discounting. We tend to underestimate the long-term future. And the Savannah environment was a pretty safe bet to orient toward the moment. When you bring down a mammoth, it's best to fill your belly because the meat will rot. So that's the best strategy for that environment. And that's not a good idea for the modern environment. For the modern environment, you don't want to be short-term oriented. You want to be long-term oriented. I mean, if you bring down a mammoth, you can freeze the meat now, but of course, you're not going to do that. But you can invest your money in a bank. You can invest in your professional development and your career. I mean, in the Savannah environment, what are you going to do? Become a better ex-chipper or something? That's not what you're there for. But in the modern environment, you can. And of course, you can invest in improving your organization. That's not something that's intuitive to us. So a lot of people underestimate the long-term and prioritize the short-term, including with the pandemic when they rush to reopen and they don't think about all the consequences of doing so and all the problems with the pandemic and how they might be much better off if they make a strategic pivot and don't fall into the planning fallacy, don't fall into hyperbolic discounting, consider the long-term impact of the pandemic. They'll still be around for at least a year. So how are you going to adapt your organization and your plans, your own plans to that situation? So don't underestimate the long-term outcomes and impacts of the pandemic. So these are the 3 cognitive biases I want to highlight. And now I want to go back to the poll. So please make sure to go back to the poll and vote. Which of the cognitive biases that I just discussed is most problematic for your organization? So please go ahead and vote. So normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, or hyperbolic discounting. Which of them is the most problematic for your organization? Good, I assume that most people are on, so 40 out of 48. Hopefully a couple more people can get on to make their voices heard. And I see of the people who are on, we have 78% of the people voted. Let's get a few more people voting. So I'll give 10 more seconds both for people to get on and to vote. So please go ahead, make your voices heard. Okay. Be closing out the poll in 3 seconds. So if you haven't voted, make sure to vote. All right, so you should be able to see the results. So we have hyperbolic discounting doesn't seem like much of a problem. And the normalcy bias seems to be one of the biggest problems. So pretty big problem for just over a third of you. You see that as your biggest problem. So it's good that you're identifying that. That means that you really want to be thinking about, okay, how are you adapting to the current disruption and how are you going to be adapting to the next disruption? So you want to make sure to adapt well to COVID, but also prepare for the future because your organizations are going to be underestimating the impact of future disruptions. And planning fallacy seems to be the biggest challenge. So that seems to be really for over half of you, just about 60%, the biggest challenge that you're facing. Planning fallacy has to do, of course, with COVID, but also with a lot of just plans that we make. Strategic planning, long-term planning. A lot of organizations don't do very well on that at all. So that's something you need to be thinking about, how to help your organization address that. So now that you're voted, that you know the biggest problem in your organization, you want to be thinking about how to get this information to your leadership, to the decision makers, to your team. All right. Let's talk a little bit about addressing these problems. How can businesses prepare? And this, of course, goes to other organizations if you're not part of a business. If you're a nonprofit, if you're a government agency, you need to make changes to your organizational model for a future much more focused on virtual interactions than you have been focusing on so far. You want to make a commitment to virtual teams and offerings, and this feels uncomfortable. I tell my clients this and they push back and they say, well, isn't this pandemic going to be over soon, blah, 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 blah. And we talk about this and I tell them that, hey, I can pretty much guarantee to you that we'll soon be facing in your state, if you're not currently facing a restriction on coming to the office, you at some point will be pretty soon because of this third wave. And right now, in a number of states, that's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. A number of states are specifically imposing restrictions on businesses, telling non-essential businesses to close and telling them to make sure that they have their workers work from home. I can guarantee to you that this will happen in Pennsylvania eventually. So some version of this, whether it's going to be forced or so on, maybe in your city, maybe in the whole state, it's going to happen. So this is the best bet for you, is to make a commitment to virtual teams, virtual offerings. Strongly consider ending office space lease, or at least reducing it to 10% of your current space. Maybe keep a couple, 1 to 2 people there who need to be there, deal with payroll and so on. However, that needs to be handled, but really reduce it, have as much as possible in virtual interactions. So that's what I strongly encourage you to do, kind of as a basic framework. And then within that framework, the internal business model, you want to change a lot of things about your internal business model as you move to more working from home. And this is something that people don't really think about. They think, well, okay, I'm working from home, I'll figure it out, I'll adapt to it. But there's a number of long-term changes that you need to be thinking about to address the challenges of working from home effectively. Here are the 6 areas that you need to address. The first area is internal controls. As payroll professionals, I'm sure that's pretty obvious to you that ensuring financial security is your first job. So ensuring financial security, ensuring that the payroll goes through on time in a financially secure way. That's a high priority. And a number of people, unfortunately, are not well adapted to ensuring financial security in working from home settings. I mean, I had a senior payroll executive at an organization for which I was consulting. I was helping them adapt to the pandemic. They had a situation where a senior payroll executive got frustrated with not being able to access their virtual computer from home. So they were trying to access their computer. And so they turned off their firewall. That is just not a good idea. That is not a good idea at all. So you need to be able to do things like this, prevent cybersecurity vulnerabilities, ensure financial security. And then you need to adapt your existing compliance practices. So whatever compliance practices are currently in the organization, you need to be thinking about how to adapt them to virtual settings, whether it has to do with things like cyberbullying, sexual harassment, HR issues, and of course, a number of financial kind of compliance issues, to the extent that you do interact in person. So for example, a number of my clients have meetings in co-working spaces. You want to adapt to CDC guidelines. That's very important. And then you want to revise your internal measurements of efficiency and effectiveness. It's too often that internal measurements are based on time. So punching in, punching out. That's not going to be nearly as effective for people who work from home because, of course, their lives are much more disrupted when they have home-based activities. So you want to move to much more task-based measurements of efficiency and effectiveness from hourly-based measurements. So as long as someone's getting their work done, their tasks accomplished in an effective manner, that's what you should focus on. Motivation engagement. This is something that people are starting to think about now that they're realizing there's challenges in retention, challenges in turnover, challenges in motivation engagement. Already before the pandemic, Gallup surveys show that only 34% of all employees were fully engaged, which means that they were loyal, committed, creative, innovative, ready to sacrifice, to problem solve for the organization. Most people, maybe around 50%, were relatively disengaged. They were passive, just coming in, punching the clock, doing the bare minimum. And around 15% or so were actively hostile, looking to leave the organization, bad-mouthing it, and so on. Working from home causes more disengagement because of tribalism. So tribalism is a very important part of who we were. We lived in the savanna environment in these small tribes of 15 to 150 people. And as a result, we got used to working in our tribe. So not having those people around in the home office, Zoom meeting just doesn't feel the same. We feel a lack of motivation, a lack of fulfillment, a lack of meaning and purpose from being near other employees. And there is an additional stress. You adjust your personal life and household to the pandemic. This is an area of support and guidance. You need to help your employees have a good sense of fulfillment, meaning, and purpose. And there are ways of accomplishing that and engaging them. We can talk about them in the Q&A if you wish to, but that's something that you need to address. Then effective communication. So this is the third area I want to highlight. In communication virtually, this is much different than in-person communication. There's a lot of written communication, much more written communication right now, because transitioning to Slack, Trello, Asana, Mondays, Microsoft Teams, whatever software you're using, there's much more written communication going on. And you just can't hear other people's tone of voice. Obviously, that's an issue. If I say something like, I think Mary should take that project versus I think Mary should take that project. Those two sentences mean very different things, but when I write them down, they mean the same thing. And of course, you can't see my expression, so can't really tell my emotions when I write things down, and, unless I use emojis, which is not considered very professional in most settings. This is an area where you can actually train people, fortunately. So I can talk about that in the Q&A. You can train employees on effective virtual communication, how to communicate in virtual teams. And another area that you really need to make sure you address is resolving conflicts. In the office, it's much easier to resolve conflicts because in face-to-face interactions, you can actually see when somebody is having a challenge, when they're having negative emotions, surprise, upset, frustrated. You can see this. You can see it on their face, on their body, but on written communication and Microsoft Teams, it's much hard to see that. So you're not able to notice problems and solve them. And of course, even when they do come up, the challenge in effective communication makes it more difficult. So it's easier to go unnoticed, it's harder to resolve them. This is another area where you need to offer training. Cultivating trust. This is something that we do naturally as a tribe where when in the office environment, you meet over the water cooler, you talk about what your kids did, what you did on your vacation, all of these sorts of things, the local football team, something like that. But this is not something that happens naturally in virtual environments. So it's easy to build relationships in office environments, not so much in virtual environments. So you want to create specific settings and venues for this to happen. This is not a matter of training, like some of the other stuff I talked about. This is something that a venue needs to be created to address this. And finally, accountability. Accountability. In the office environment, it's much easier to hold employees accountable. You can walk around as a supervisor, as a manager, see who's doing what, see who's disengaged, and talk to them and see what's up. But in virtual environments, it's not something that you can easily do. So there are new structures that must be created to enable accountability. And this is accountability up the chain of command, but also peer-to-peer accountability. In the office environment, you can pop into Michael's office and say, hey, Michael, where's that report that you're promising to send me? Or you can pop into the HR office and say, hey, why did you tell this employee to hand in their pay stub late or something like that? Why are you asking for exemptions to this situation? Didn't we talk to, we from Payroll talk to you from HR about not doing this in the future? Well, this is something that, Michael is not going to be able to ignore you when you're standing in his office door, but it's much easier to ignore a Microsoft Teams message. So these are the areas of the business model that you need to address. And now I want to go back to the poll that you were on and ask you to vote on how well has your organization transformed its organizational model to adapt to the pandemic. Based on what we've just, those 6 areas that we've just covered, if you think about those areas and other areas, how has your organization transformed its organizational model to adapt to the pandemic? So think about those 6 areas and other areas that might be relevant. And of course, those 6 areas are just the general ones that apply to all organizations. All right, so I see that we have 40 people on, great. So ideally we get a few more people on, and definitely more people voting. So we see that 85% of the people voted. Let's get a little bit more people voting. Give you 10 seconds to go on if you're not on yet and vote. So make sure to go to the chat and go to the website and vote. Okay, closing out in 3 seconds. All right, so we see that just under 45% of the organizations are doing great. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad that your organization is doing great. So, but most organizations need some improvement, and then a few organizations need serious work. So 55% of organizations, 53% of the organizations need some improvement, and 3% need serious work. So it's good that you're realizing this, and you can bring back this information about those 6 areas that I talked about and just kind of the underlying principles, and think about what can be done to address the problems there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you can change your planning to adapt to the pandemic and its still continuing, unfortunately, impact on us. So planning for the long-term impact of the pandemic. There are 6 areas that you need to plan for. First, you need to think about the possible futures. What are the possible futures for your organizations? And then invest your resources accordingly. You want to be thinking about at least 3 futures: the optimistic future, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one. So what does it mean for you? Well, one thing for the optimistic future would be if indeed the Pfizer vaccine is very highly effective and safe, and the government turns out to be incredibly competent at distributing the vaccine. Unfortunately, the government has not shown too much, the federal government I'm talking about here, has not shown too much competence in the process of dealing with medical issues like testing and personal protective equipment. So I wouldn't be too optimistic about the government being highly effective in distributing the vaccine and having an educational campaign about why people should be vaccinated. But that's certainly a scenario that you can be thinking about. So that's one sort of scenario. Oh, okay, hold on for a second. Thank you for pointing out. Somebody pointed out that the screen was still showing the poll. So when you're looking at a possible futures, you want to look at a variety of them and invest your resource accordingly. So again, the optimistic one, I mentioned what it might mean for an optimistic future. For a moderate future, you can imagine a moderate level of government competence. So let's say an optimistic future, that might mean that the large majority of the population would be vaccinated by mid-fall of next year, so maybe by October. So that's going to be super optimistic. Then a moderate future would be sometime by the beginning of 2021. And a pessimistic future would say that the Pfizer vaccine actually turns out to be effective but not safe. There are too many side effects and it's not approved. And that can happen too. And that's just one example of what it means for a future to be optimistic, moderate, or pessimistic. That's applicable to all organizations. You want to be thinking about what's going on for your organization. Each organization, of course, and your career as well. Each organization has its own aspects of dealing with the pandemic. So if you're, let's say, working in a chain of restaurants, that will be pretty difficult, unfortunately, especially given new research showing that restaurants are a major cause of spreading the disease, and a lot of states are going to be shutting down, severely limiting the capacity of restaurants, let's say. Hotels also, they're going to be suffering, they're going to be in trouble, and gyms, bars, so thinking about that, live event venues. If you're working in a company that benefits from working at home, then you'll be pretty well off for a certain period of time while people are dealing with the pandemic. These are things you want to be thinking about. What does it mean for you to be optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic? Then think about 5 years out. What does the future look like in 5 years out for you, for your company, in each of these scenarios? The optimistic scenario, the moderate scenario, and the pessimistic scenario. And you can have several optimistic, several moderate, and several pessimistic scenarios where things can combine with vaccines, and things can combine with specific dynamics for your company, for whatever your sector looks like. Then think about problems. What kind of problems would your company face in each of these scenarios? Think through specifically and carefully each of the problems, and what ways can you address them in advance? So for example, having issues with virtual interactions, with virtual teams. You might not want to yo-yo back and forth from telecommuting and going to the office. Instead, you might just want to make a commitment to virtual teams or largely virtual teams or something like that. And that helps you address a lot of problems and disruption in advance. Make a plan to resolve problems if they do occur, if you can't address them in advance. About opportunities, what kind of opportunities can you do? There are many opportunities that you can take advantage of in the situation, in each of these scenarios. You want to think about ways that you can take advantage of them right now to bring them about. Maybe there are certain steps that you can take to change how you do things that bring about an opportunity. Or you can make a plan to seize an opportunity if they do occur. Then think about the resources. Don't fall into planning fallacy. Don't underestimate the resources needed for each of these scenarios. Money, time, information, I talked about this, strategic planning, social capital. I want to encourage you to make a plan to reserve sufficient resources for the worst case scenario. We might hope for the best, but you really got to prepare for the worst. That is the best option. That is the safest option. So protect yourself and reserve enough resources for the pessimistic scenario. Don't plan for the optimistic scenario. It would be great if it happens, but you don't want to plan for it. Again, you hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And finally, information. What kind of information would inform you that which of these scenarios is taking place? Hopefully, by the end of the year, we'll find out from the FDA whether they approve the Pfizer study, whether that's indeed indicative of an effective and a safe vaccine. That's certainly going to be one source. And think about other sources that you can trust. Probably not Elon Musk or Goldman Sachs at this point. Monitor the information closely and adjust your plans accordingly, and then execute thoroughly on the plans. All right, I'm going to go back to the poll. This is going to be our last poll. How well suited do you think are your organization's strategic plans to the long-term consequences of the pandemic? So now that we talked about planning, think about your organization's strategic plans. How well are they suited to the long-term consequences of the pandemic? Are they well suited to the pessimistic outcomes? Are they well suited to at least the moderate, but you really got to be well suited to the pessimistic outcomes and be prepared for it. So think about that and please vote on it. I was asked to post the website again, so make sure to check it out in the chat, the website, go there and vote. See, 88%, 90% of the people voted. I'll give you 10 more seconds. So again, thinking about those 6 areas that I outlined, how well suited is your strategic plan to the consequence of the pandemic? Keep in mind the potential for the worst case pessimistic outcome. You want to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Give it 3 more seconds and I'll close out. So make sure to get your votes in. All right. So you should be able to see that just over a third of you have your strategic plan is very well adapted to the pandemic. I'm glad to hear that. So excellent. That's great. So you don't need to make changes if you see your organization's strategic plan as well adapted. But just about 2/3, just under 2/3 need some changes. So that's something you got to be thinking about. Just under 60% need some moderate tweaks. And so you want to think about those strategy for long-term planning that I outlined and how you can have those moderate tweaks likely to make sure that you include a variety of scenarios which are more pessimistic and that you make sure to think about problems in advance and how to solve them. And just under 3% of you need serious revisions. So you got to be seriously thinking, sitting down as a major priority, how to make those revisions. All right, great. So that's what I wanted to share. And then for you, additional resources, I'll watch for an email from the trainer. So I'll send you an email with additional resources where you can take advantage of a free coaching session with me. So I'm integrating this information into your organization, no charge, just free coaching session. And then 2 chapters from my new book that Pat talked about, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So that's what we're for, and that's where we're at. And now we're going to go to the question and answer. All right. For the question and answer, please type your question into the chat. That's going to be probably easiest for most people to type your questions into the chat. But if you prefer and if it's easy for you to do, you can just unmute yourself and then ask the question that way. I'm happy to answer questions that way. So whether you want to type it into the chat, which I think I've seen most people prefer that, or you want to unmute yourself, either way, go for it. Look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. I appreciate your attendance and for handling the presentation. It was wonderful, Gleb. I think Gleb has emailed each and every one of you since you logged in a web address for you to send your questions to. So if you have those, please do so, and he will be happy to respond.
Mm-hmm. I saw Dawn has a question. She chatted.
Wonderful.
What have you found to be the biggest issue when trying to implement changes to business processes due to COVID? What I've seen as the biggest issue is people not being willing to think about the long term and being very comfortable with where they are and just kind of ignoring. So the hyperbolic discounting and planning fallacy, that's kind of what I've seen being the biggest issues in recent days. Earlier, the normalcy bias was the biggest, where people were just not willing to believe that COVID is a major, huge disruptor. But right now, in my more recent work with strategic pivoting for companies, it's been just the planning fallacy and hyperbolic discounting, ignoring the fact that the pandemic will still be going on for a very long time. I mean, realistically, a year, if not more. So thinking about, okay, you really got to be oriented toward the long term. If we are in this state for another year, what are we going to do to change our business processes? That is what I've seen be the biggest challenge, the biggest issue in trying to implement. So people not being willing to really orient toward the long term. So that's the first question. And then Dawn, you're very welcome. Then Richard Moyle messaged me privately asking, what's the best way to keep employees engaged when working remotely? So what you got to have them do is, first of all, make sure that they have a good setup. And that's something that I've seen way too few. It's a super easy thing to, to help your employees have a good work at home setup. And some people, they will want to get out of a closet where some people are actually working, their kitchen table, make sure that they have a room, make sure that they have a private space, and that requires money. It's going to be here for another year, so you got to give them some money, some funding, which you're not spending on other areas. If you're going to be reducing your real estate footprint, I'm encouraging a lot of clients, and they're doing this, that they're redirecting that money from reducing the real estate footprint to giving support to their team members. About $5,000 is the standard amount that I've seen to set up a serious working from home environment. So whether that means purchasing some furniture, and for some people it means getting a co-working space, so where they can go and they can be free from distractions, and that 5,000 should be more than sufficient for that. Kind of buying into a co-working, even less. But that's, I mean, whatever you can afford, of course. But that's something that I've seen is a really important area. So that's one. Second is to help people realize that the issue is not simply working from home. The working from home engagement, people are just thinking, oh, I'm burned out and working from home, this is tiring. That's not what's happening. We're not the only thing. People have not processed overwhelmingly the grief and stress of the pandemic. And they don't realize that they get fulfillment from being next to other people, next to you, next to everyone else. And they don't realize what they lost. So they're trying to get it. They're trying to have more Zoom meetings. They're trying to have more engagement, but they're not realizing what they lost. They're not realizing the magnitude of their loss of their coworkers. They haven't kind of grieved over the loss of these processes, of their community next to each other, and they haven't figured out how to replace this. So how to replace this with other forms of social connection. So you need to help them realize that these are losses that they're actually experiencing, that they're not getting fulfilled in ways that they previously were fulfilled. And it doesn't mean, it's not about the company being bad, because some people are actually blaming the company and say, oh, the company is not making me fulfilled anymore. Well, that's not what was making you fulfilled in the first place. It's the company of fellow humans that was making you fulfilled, who are working around you. So you got to make sure that they realize it's not the company, it's just the situation, and they need to find other ways of getting fulfilled. And then one of the ways that you can help them get fulfilled is to ensure that there are social interactions that are built into virtual spaces. I talked about that kind of as cultivating trust. So cultivating trust, you need to take those opportunities. They won't be nearly as fulfilling as in-person interactions, but something that has been quite helpful is having each day employees start, whether you have Microsoft Teams, Trello, Asana, you should always be able to have a channel or a card or something where you comment. And we can have a channel for private comments for team members, 6 to 8 people on the team, right? So where people share what they're doing, what they're feeling, how their day is going, something personal about themselves that other team members don't know. So to keep up that the same sort of interaction that you would have over the water cooler, and starting your day with this sort of interaction, and then responding to 3 other people who do that sort of same sharing. That helps replace some of the personal engagement and keeps you human to each other. Reminds us that we're human beings. Then you can also have that open throughout the day so that anyone can share anything throughout the day. So you have that obligatory sharing in the morning, and then continual engagement throughout the day. That is really helpful. Great. Linda said that her company has a great protocol. I'm very glad. So that's pretty rare. So that's I very much admire that your company had a pandemic protocol in place. The large majority of companies did not. So that's wonderful. And I'm very glad for you, Linda. So excellent. All right. Any other questions? So either unmute yourself or chat. All right, it appears that there are no further questions. So, okay, Bruce said that they set up a lunchtime Zoom meeting for general chit chat. Yes, that's a good idea. So kind of setting up meetings, not for work stuff, but just for chit chat. That's definitely a way that you can go as well. All right. Well, thank you everyone for checking out the presentation. I hope you found it helpful.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Gleb. Everyone enjoy the upcoming holidays. Keep an eye out for an email about upcoming meetings and the election that's going to be taking place shortly. And thanks again, Dr. Gleb. This was awesome stuff. I appreciate you coming on tonight.
Thank you again. And yeah, I want to respond to Rebecca, who said that thank you for the last piece about being human in this virtual time. Yes, a lot of people are missing it. And this is something that we really need to realize. It's something that's very fulfilling for us. And that's something that we previously got fulfilled in the workplace, but didn't realize that that was something that we got fulfilled in the workplace. And that's something you need to figure out how to address and adapt to the current situation, help your employees do so. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a good day.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.